Unsilenced Voices of Young Tibetans is a podcast presented by the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives, where young Tibetans share their personal stories, experiences, opinions, and journey in exile. Tashi Dilek, and welcome to our FNVA podcast, Unsilenced Voices of Young Tibetans. People around the world are given daily updates of events and occurrences happening around them, day in and day out. It is the reporters, the journalists, the editors, the cameramen, the technicians, and several other invested individuals who form this large entity known as the media. They bring telling stories to our screens and are referred as the fourth pillar of democracy. And today, on that context, I would like to welcome our guest. She's a journalistic individual to say the least, and we first came across each other at TCV Suja. She completed her UG from Lady Shriram College and her PG from the Asian College of Journalism. She has worked professionally as a journalist in Payu Media and the print. Welcome to our podcast, Zumbala.
Thank you, Damdul. I've been a podcast enthusiast for long, so I'm very excited to be on this show. Thanks for having me.
No, the pleasure is all ours, Zompa. So, before going to the nit and gritty, I think it's a term which our previous guest, Tilela, was constantly using. Like, I would like to ask you whether you could share your experiences, the childhood experiences for that matter,
Mhm.
especially growing up as a twin.
Yeah, so I have a twin sister. Her name is Tenzin Zompa, and it was always a huge blessing for me to have her in my life because she has been through we've been through tough times, and she's always been with beside me, like supporting me, motivating me to always do better in life. So yeah, I cannot thank God enough for having her in my life. So Dolkar and I also, like many other Tibetan kids, we started going to TCV school. We were only 6 years old when we were enrolled in Tibetan school. Lower Dharamsala is a boarding school. So honestly speaking, I used to hate boarding school a lot because I used to miss my parents. And yeah, Dolkar and I were the kids like who used to go to the washroom and cry our eyes out when our parents drop us at the school after vacation. So yeah, initially I used to hate boarding school, but on a technical, like on a more serious note, I think TCV has really shaped my thinking as an earlier kid, as a very young kid, because I believe that in TCV most of our teachers and the staff would make us realize that we are someone who is living in someone else's country. So there was a teacher in Tibet, there was a Tibetan teacher who used to always reiterate the fact that there are invisible R's on our forehead that you'd never forget it, so he would always motivate us that you need to put an extra effort to achieve your goals, because you are not living your life for yourselves, but you should also think about Tibetans inside Tibet. So this whole sort of thinking really shaped us when we grew up. And that was also one of the factors that led me into journalism, and I wanted to report about Tibet and stuff like that. So yeah, I think we'll talk about that more in detail later. Yeah.
And
So yeah.
that's
Yeah.
an interesting, feeling and experience that you shared because I myself joined TCV when I was, I think, third grade.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, when you just said that, like how we would dread going for boarding school. I remember my first day, I was bawling the whole day. It was just the second day that you started to realize, oh, now I'm here. I have to study, like.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless of all the personal experiences, I definitely second what you say. TCV has really done a lot for us, not only
Mm-hmm.
me and you, but thousands of Tibetans. And I think it's an honor to study in that school.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, when I look back, it was one of the major takeaways from my days at TCV school was the fact that it really sort of influenced us in the way we see the world, in the way we perceive our identity, in the way we learn about the Tibetan struggles, how Tibetan inside Tibet are dealing through a lot of stuff, and how the world are looking at our issues and stuff like that. So TCV, I think, played a major role into shaping our life choices, our career, or for that matter. Yeah, I think I still think so. Yeah. So whenever I have my discussions with my friends, we used to talk back about how um very little things that, like, maybe the advices that the teachers gave about the art thing, it's still very much ingrained in us when we grow up. So it's like, it has very deep down effect within all of us as an individual. I mean, personally for me it has. Yeah, so that is.
Yeah, and I think it's not only for you, even for me. I think like TCV
uh,
will always be in my heart.
mhm. Yeah,
So I
it
think
was.
we talked a bit about your school, like
Mhm,
TCV. So I think we can now discuss more about like when you left TCV. Like
mhm,
right after leaving TCV, you joined one of the most prestigious women's college in India, Lady Sri Ram. So
mhm.
what was your feeling when you first entered it, and what were your emotions when you left it? Left the college, I must say. And
Yeah.
what sort of impact did it have to your overall Tibetan identity?
So when, like, I was first introduced to LSR by my cousin sibling. She studied political science there, and so she always spoke very highly of the college, and she wanted me to get through it. So I was like, so yeah, getting into LSR was one of my primary goal in life. It was like, the first bucket list sort of thing. So when I got through the cutoff and stuff like that, when I first entered the college, I was quite, like, still nervous about it, like the whole experience. I was like the imposter syndrome, right? Am I good enough? Do I really belong here and stuff like that? So I was quite nervous at first because like, shifting from a Tibetan school to college like LSR was a huge in like, huge change for me. It was a very the environment was like huge. There was a big difference between what and how we converse in, like, how we learned in TCV school and then in LSR. Because in LSR, when I went there, I was like, most of the people converse in English, right? They speak in English. So I was like, we were not used to that. And initially I struggled a lot in articulating my thoughts and views, like, interacting with them was also very difficult for me because I wasn't that much fluent. So I was like, am I getting it right? Is it right? Like, are there grammatical mistakes in my sentences and stuff like that? But then, yeah, gradually you get used to it. Like, you try to speak more in English, and that's how you, like, stop sort of like in, like, improve your fluency as well. Yeah. So when I look back, I was like, you may be also realizing that, in TCV we don't speak much in English, right? We just speak in Tibetan. And 12 years of education we just spoke in Tibetan with each other, and then you're suddenly, like, going to this college where, like, all the girls were speaking in English. And I was like, okay, now I'm getting the FOMO stuff, like, am I good enough? Like, is it like, am I just gonna, like, like because of my speaking and stuff like that? So yeah, when I first entered college, I wasn't that much, like, sort of what prepared for the kind of, like, competition, or the, like, because there you get, like, you get to meet people who are very brilliant, like, intelligent women out there. So I was like first very nervous, but then yeah, gradually you get used to it, like, you sort of like improve and stuff.
Yeah, like I think that's one thing that we Tibetans sort of face when we join, like when we leave our a Tibetan school, like be it TCV, be it Homes, be it
Hmm.
CST, be it even the somewhat a Tibetan school these days. Yeah, like and the one of the major problems that you mentioned, articulating our thoughts, like we want to say something, but due to our language barriers, it prevents us. But I think
Yeah.
like having those experiences, breaking those barriers, like coming out from it, like we
Hmm.
grow up and become more resilient.
Yeah, that's right. And at one point it's very frustrating, like, when you're not able to express your thoughts and views. I was at point, like, I was so frustrated, like, did I, like, put it right? Did I put it right? Or, like, when there's class presentation and stuff like that, I was like, oh my god, did I get it right? So then, yeah, gradually you want to, like, better yourself, and then you become good at it, I think. Yeah. And in LSR, the thing was that uh, just I was not very much into the department lectures because journalism wasn't into, like, wasn't much about the bookish knowledge. So in LSR, the unique thing was that, I mean, the magical experience for me was that the classroom was not just defined by the classroom, but then you learn a lot in, like, taking part in the societies and stuff like that. So when I was a member of the project society, where they, like, go for photo walks and, like, photograph the photography society basically, I learned how to use a camera. And, like, we went for photo walk to the India Gate and stuff like that. Then you became part of the web society, and, gradually you learn how inclusive a society is built, like, so the web society, it's a usually it's a this volunteering based program. So where you can, like, go to NGOs and contribute and do some extra work for the organization and NGOs. So yeah, I mean, LSR was a magical experience because not just for the classroom or the department lectures, but outside that, like you get to attend the lectures every week. There's a speaker coming up, and it's just not the journalism department that's organizing these talks, but then English department, the sociology department. So yeah, I was very much enthralled into like going to these lectures than than the classes that my department were organizing.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's what we, some of us, like Tibetans who joined Delhi University, be it like LSR or other college, like if you talk in terms of Gold College, there is Miranda and there are Daulat Ram. Like for boys, like go ahead, we have Hindu College, St. Stephen. So I think the experience at DU, like the beyond class level sort of experience, was very enriching, and
Hmm.
that is what I get from what you say right now. So a very magical experiences, as you say,
Yeah.
like LSR.
Yeah, that's right.
So
Magical palace, they say.
now hearing about your college experiences, like I want to ask you, why did you get into journalism, Zompa? Like,
Oh yeah. So it was when I was in my sixth standard, I think. So you have this career counseling classes, right, where
yeah,
the
yeah.
teacher would ask you what you're into, what you want to study, like even the basic instinct, like So in my sixth standard, I was like, I wanted to become a journalist because I thought, like, I had the truth to tell the world about what happened to Tibet. At that time, I was like very much angry about the fact that, how the world could forget what China did to Tibet, and how unfair of the world to even forget about what we're going through, what the Tibetans in Tibet are going through. So these questions, they keep me up at night. And I was like, yeah, I have a truth that I have to tell the world. And, like, I'm going to become a journalist. And then highlight more about stuff that's happening inside Tibet that has happened with us, and how wrong was that. So that's how, like, I said, like, I'll become a journalist one day, and, like, tell the world and remind the world of how China has been going through, like, all of these stuff. And even now they're, like, doing these, have been continuing to, like, violate the human rights uh, situation in Tibet. So that was the thing that drove me into journalism. The fact that, like, I realized that it was not only the Tibetans who were oppressed by any superpowers like China. I realized that there was so many, like, story of oppression even in the Indian society. Is like when you hear about the how low caste people are treated, like, you also get, like, then I also get alarmed, I also get angry, and I'm like, okay, I need to tell their stories as well. So it's just not then, as I grew up, I was like, there's so many people whose voices are oppressed and they're silenced. So that's how, when I worked with the print, and, like, when I went to Chennai and LSR, I realized that I cannot just be, like, go about telling about just focus on Tibet and how they've been going through. But there are so many voices whose were silence, who needs, like, whose voices need to be amplified. And so I, like, okay, so China is not only the bad guy, because so any superpower nation, like, say, United States, they have their, like, they have been a bad guy. For example, what I've done to the Middle Eastern countries, it's also very, like, they have violated human rights as well. So as I grew up, I realized that China is not only the bad guy. So even in Indian society, lower caste people, they are being oppressed, they are being silenced. And when I went on one of the field story to cover the rape of a lower caste girl, I was also very much angry. The same anger I had for my Tibetans in Tibet, I had that for my, like, Indian people, the lower caste Indians. I thought their voices also need to be amplified. So that sort of, like, fire, or, like, how should I put this sort of, like, a duty or the urgency kept me going in life. So when I worked for the print, I sort of realized more that, like, the duty of journalists. I not only wanted to become a journalist because of because what my brothers and sisters in Tibet are going through, but also because there's so many other people inside the world whose voices need to be amplified, whose stories needs to be told. So yeah, that's how, like, I got, like, much deeper into the journalism, and, like, got a sense of duty about, okay, I need to tell this to the world. So yeah, so it initially started when I was in sixth standard, because in lower TCV, I don't know about other TCVs, but then in lower TCV, there's in assembly we used to read news stories, like what's happening inside Tibet and what's happening around the world with regards to the Tibetan diaspora and stuff like that. And I used to take part in most of those sessions, and whenever I read about stuff happening inside Tibet, it was only about, it was in, I think, 2018, or no, it was, I think, in 2009 or 10. But it was, the stories were mostly about the number of self-immolation that has been rising. So whenever I read about the headline, it was just, what were the kajam, like kajam, the last words the patriarch said. And that also, like very much angered me into, like why the world is not giving attention to us, like people who are self-humiliating themselves. And yeah, so yeah, in sixth standard I used to, like so these like thoughts kept me going in life, like okay, I need to become a journalist because these stories needs to be told. So that's how, like those I mean energy stayed within me, and then I, yeah, got into this career.
That's a very elongated, detailed, and some an answer that all of us must try to keep it in our heart. I think you mentioned anger, but I think more than anger, what you showed here was empathy. I think these sort of empathy of, like, we Tibetans tend to sometimes become close-minded. We just tend to think about why only Tibetans. But the real deal here is it's not only us Tibetans. A lot of people are oppressed, are
Hmm.
being suppressed, and which you clearly mentioned. So it was an interesting thing that you discussed. So moving on, Zumpa, like you've mentioned a bit in your answer right now, but you've worked in the Payu Media, a Tibetan news outlet, and also the print, which you mentioned, which is an Indian news outlet and has of late been, getting more traction in the Indian media. So what were your experiences there, and how different was it working for these two news outlets?
Um, with the Payul, I only interned for, I think, 2 months when I was in LSR. I was in my second years that time, and I took during the vacation I went to Dharamsala to intern with Payul. And before that, I wasn't aware of, like any internship opportunities with Tibetan media platforms. And Payul and print were, like two complete different outlets. And for with Payu, what we basically did was, so I didn't get much opportunities when I was with Payu, so they didn't ask me to go on field and, like interview people like they have been doing now, because now people are getting opportunities with Payu as well. But when I was interning, I didn't get much opportunity. So what I was basically told to do was do desk reporting. We just track news and developments happening inside Tibet, happening in abroad countries like United States, UK, and then, like what is happening inside India, what was happening within the exile community. So we just basically track these developments and curate reports online, like just quote reports. So it was basically desk reporting. Honestly speaking, the learning scope was a little bit limited with Payul. But when I like after graduating from ECJ, I landed at a job with the print. And the print obviously was a larger platform than Payul, so their area of focus was also largely focused on politics, governance, and, like military developments and stuff like that. So I also get the opportunity to go on field, which I always wanted to. So I went on field to cover the COVID-19 pandemic. The So there was this instance in Agra where the, like where the doctors were organizing some mock drill, due to which many patients died and stuff like that. And also I get to, like went on field to report on instances where, like I told, as I stated earlier, a Dalit victim was raped and she died. So these kind of opportunities sort of, like provided me a wider practical exposure into the functioning of an actual newsroom. So yeah. And I don't, like Payul that time wasn't like it wasn't a large unit. It wasn't a large unit, so the correspondents, they basically sort of like work from home that time. But now I think Payul has also expanded their, I think, members, and so they do documentaries and stuff like that, which I really appreciate. Yeah.
So Zomba, like while answering here, you mentioned something interesting about how even though you were like a desk correspondent, like nothing much to do was there for you, like, but you were, I mean, requested or you were asked to collect reports from Tibet. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, we all of us know that getting information from Tibet is very hard, no? Like
Mm-hmm.
we have American passed the RATA Act, the Reciprocal Access of Tibet Act, for this particular reason. So how What level of difficulty and what were your experiences while collecting such reports happening in Tibet, which is currently, occupied by China, and a lot of brutal things are happening, no?
Hmm. With the print, so my ultimate goal in life was to visit Tibet. So, like, honestly speaking, I wanted to, kind of like stay away from doing stuff that might be critical of, like, the PRC. So I was like, I've always been wanting to visit Tibet. So I tried to stay away from it. But on few instances, I covered the for instance, the first person I spoke to was a source who was based in South India, and he apparently had sources within Tibet, and this was regarding a monk who recently died after he was released by the China in after he was released from prison by Chinese government. And when I spoke to him, he, like, he consistently, he, like, repeatedly mentioned that, like, his name shouldn't be cited anywhere in the report. So, there was this, like, he was saying that again and again. I was like, so you should be at ease, because I won't be citing your name. I won't be, like, you will be cited as anonymous. So you see the level of pressure, these people have when they speak to Indian reporters or reporters of any kind. Is like crazy, like, they fear for their lives. And that was how I, like, sort of understood the, like, the sensitivity of the subject, if they speak to people like us. And secondly, I have one of my close friend in Tibet, and I wanted to do a story on the recent young artist who died, who self-immolated himself. But I just, like, casually, I just casually asked if she used to listen to his songs. And then she completely backed off, saying, like, don't do it, like, don't do stuff like that. So you see, I was shocked at her response, because I didn't know, the government is tracking that level. I mean, the sort of like, uh, I didn't know they used to track these in detail. But she was very much skeptical about even talking about that subject. I just asked if she used to listen to these songs. So it was very hard for me to, like, even work on stories like that, like, which is very sensitive, because uh, it really threatens their, like, sort of safety inside Tibet. So it sort of act as a very huge barrier for me to, like, work on those stories even when you want to. And yeah, that's why I sort of like focus more into the stories which is happening inside the exile community. So that, like, okay, because that way you have more sources on ground, and the stories also come out good. So this was, yeah, the Jigme Gyatso. The source that I spoke to had his source inside Tibet, but they were quite skeptical about speaking to me at first. And then I was like, I'll not quote you anywhere, I'll not quote you anywhere. And after many, like, requests, they were like, okay, now we'll speak to you. So yeah, that acts as a huge sort of like hurdle for us to even, like, work on such stories. But that these stories are extremely important, like, very sensitive as well. Yeah.
Definitely, Zompa. Like as you mentioned, we need to cover such stories because these are the real, instances, the events, the the happenings in Tibet, like which we outside of Tibet must not only know, but we must share. And your work of journalism particularly dwells on it. And for me also as a personal experience, like I can see these sort of threats, like how, see, we are in a way threatened, even though we are not inside Tibet, we are threatened by this, no? Such
Hmm.
action, how we can't get information. So these levels of transnational aggression is very much pertaining what China is doing these days. And I think just recently after the 20th National Party Congress, it's more likely to, increase rather than decrease. And a particular experience that I felt is like, even though it doesn't have to deal with information inside Tibet, like something regarding China, even in India, if you want to collect information on that, people are very, like hesitant to
Yeah.
be a source, as you say. Like, so I think this shows the level of intimidation factor that China has, and I think more or less it would only be growing as they grow more
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah, as you speak about that, like, I also recall a moment when I was studying in Chennai. So this was the period when Xi Jinping was coming to meet Prime Minister Modi. So the event was like it was a very like highly anticipated event. And I was a journalism student back then, so I and a few friends of mine were like told to cover how the government is preparing, how the government is gearing up ahead of Xi Jinping's visit. So we went to this place called Mahabalipuram. It's like quite away from Chennai. So we went there, and uh, so this was this was like quite shocking for me. I was quite surprised and saddened by the way they sort of like discriminated, I would say. Like, so we were entering the gate, and as a journalism student, they have no right to stop me because I was told to report on this event. But then there were five friends of mine, and I was the only one who they cornered me and told me to like show me your ID. So you said the intimidation factor, like China really intimidates India. And she said, "Ki, are you here to protest?" I said, "No sir, I'm here to cover the event." So as a Tibetan, I'm here to cover the event, right? So but as a journalism student, I'm here to. So he said, like you can't go inside. And none of my friends were asked and like questioned about like their ID card. He asked me to show me my Aadhaar card. So you see, ahead of Xi Jinping's visit, people who look like us, they stopped. Like they're not allowed. They're not allowed to enter the gate. Just even as a journalism student, I was not allowed to cover the event. So this was. I was like, oh my god, I was born here. Like how would you? Why would you do that to me? I was born here. So technically, we're an Indian, right? But the way they like treated me and the way they treated them, it was heartbreaking for me. And I was like quite embarrassed also because none of my friends were stopped, and I was the only one who was cornered out, like show me your Aadhaar card. I don't know what should I prove to them, like so that was one instance that like I mean, it will stay deep within me. Like it was quite saddening as well, but it was shocking. It was very shocking the way they treated me. And yeah, even during those instances, there was this organization called Some, right? Some.
Thumb.
So yeah, Thumb. So ahead of the Xi Jinping's visit, members of Thumb were like detained by the police station. And these kids, these students, they have tests tomorrow. They have the sessional exams tomorrow, but they weren't even like allowed. They weren't even allowed to go outside the police station. They were detained overnight just because Xi Jinping was visiting the country. How unfair is that? I mean, I went there to meet one of my friends, one of my batchmates. She was also there, and she told me the whole instance. And she was also like, you should go away because they'll also detain you now if you come here. So these people have their papers tomorrow, but Xi Jinping's more important. Yeah. So because they didn't even do anything at all. Just 2 days ahead, they would come to the university campus where they're studying, and they would like take them away. And they used to even track their messages. The president, his phone was also tracked, so he wasn't able to call anyone. I mean, I was like, this was very new to me. This was news to me. Okay, so I was like, did they really do it? I mean, is Xi Jinping that important? Like, it's like, okay.
Yep, it's very saddening to hear the level of discrimination that occurs, towards Tibetans to an extent. Like we are
Yeah,
already marginalized being a refugee, but on top of this, you have like these sort of incidents occurring. And like when you mention Xi Jinping, it's not like we are going to, like, how should I say, perform a violent act. We are going there as normal, peaceful protesters. I don't know
that's
why,
that's
Xi Jinping or even his entourage has a problem with that.
and
It's
yeah, and this is the second largest democracy in the world. And it's like irony that
it's very ironical indeed.
yeah.
So yeah, you mentioned such incidents, right? So what was going on feel like when you were covering such report, and how was it as a Tibetan journalist working for an Indian news platform? Like I
Mhm.
think you mentioned some instances, but how would you describe the experience of it? And I think some challenges you already mentioned, like being a Tibetan, how it differs from being an Indian. And are there any more personal anecdotes you would like to share on that?
Yeah, um so like you get that very often, like, are you from the northeast? So that's the like they generalized us with people from. So I get that very often. Are you from the northeast? Are you from Mizoram? They won't even ask you, where are you from? They would just ask you, are you from northeast? Are you from Mizoram? Are you from Nagaland? And stuff like that. That's one case. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, like um, I was told to go to these cremations where, like, dead bodies were coming up, and there's a pile of dead bodies everywhere where I go. So this was uh, I mean, during the peak of the pandemic in Delhi. So I was told to go to these cremations in and around Delhi and see how many bodies are coming on ground. So I used to go to I used to go to these places and ask how many bodies are, because there was a huge gap between the actual numbers and the numbers of bodies that were really coming up on ground. So in one of the cremation, it was I remember it very vividly. It was in Punjabi Bagh crematorium where I went. It was quite far away. So this guy, he literally yelled at me, and in front of all the, in front of a lot of people, he literally yelled at me, and I just said, "Sir, I'm here as a reporter. I just need to get the numbers, and I'll just leave." And then he literally yelled at me, and he kicked me out. And that was so this was one of my, early reporting days. And I sort of lost hope, I was quite heartbroken, and I was like, what do I do? There was a second instance when I was sent to a mortuary to do a feature story, and then the guard, he literally kicked out me again. And when these things happen, I don't know whether I'm right to think in this way, or even uh, I don't know whether this is rational thinking, but I used to wonder, will they treat my Indian colleague this way? If they were in my place, will they also be treated this way? Or is it just me? Is it because I don't look Indian enough? So whenever I go on field, if I get treated that way, I would always wonder. I'm not I'm not saying I'm thinking this straight, or am I blaming this on other people or stuff like that, or blaming on my incapabilities and stuff like that. But that thought always stays within me. Is this because I don't look like them? Yeah. Is this because I look like someone from China? Is it because I look Chinese more and Indian less? So these sort of I maybe these are bias, the individual bias and stuff like that. But I used to get that very often, what would they do if if someone else in my office comes here to cover this thing? Will they be treated this way? So yeah, during the pandemic, I was um yeah, I had a lot of these instances coming up. And yeah, sort of and then I went into overthinking and stuff like that. Why? And then yeah, these things happen sometimes. Yeah, but I'm not saying I'm right to think that way, but it always stays within me. I always get that question inside me.
Yeah, Zumpa, like the pandemic, especially, like the whole COVID situation, exposed a lot of things that we humans tend to keep hidden deep inside our heart. And it was released, I must say. Like
Mm.
what you felt during your own situation, how we Tibetans or even Northeasterners who look like Chinese were discriminated. Even I felt this incident. Like me and my friend, we were just walking around, a couple of Indian guys, like youngsters, just
Mhm.
came out in front of us, Chinese. So it's very sad to see such situation, like happening.
Yeah, when I was working for the print, uh, my editor, one of my editors, she used to show great interest in in the happenings, into the happenings inside Tibet, and whether it's about the self-immolation cases, or whether it's about a person dying inside a prison and stuff like that. So she used to sometimes encourage me to, okay, yeah, you can do it on this. You can make a report out of this, and you can speak to these people, and go to this event. So I've always been very much I've always admired her effort into showing great interest inside Tibet. And yeah, I mean, whatever the Tibetans are going through. So yeah, she's been a great editor and always supportive of the Tibet struggle.
Yep, and also I remember when you were working in print, how when we had this whole JNU fee hike fiasco for
Hmm.
affecting us Tibetans, you were one of the first one to, reach us out, and
Yeah.
in a way, like we couldn't fulfill our promise because we are pressured somewhere else. But
So at one moment I sort of struggled between being a Tibetan or being a journalist at first, and this was the time when Wang Yi was visiting India, and he was just leaving the Hyderabad house in his cab. So it was just the moment when he was coming out from the Hyderabad house. And I was just sitting right here, it was this much close. I was this much close to Wang Yi, the person. And but I was sent there to cover the event as a journalist. but the urge within me to protest his visit as a Tibetan, it was so strong. But then I had to take a call. So although the female police personnel have already guarded me, I couldn't say anything, and I just took his picture, and then I showed it to my editors and stuff like that. But yeah, at that moment you sort of struggle between whether you should act as a Tibetan or whether you should act as a journalist, which you were uh, which you very intended to, because you were just going there to cover the event. And only these sort of struggles sometimes do come, and you just need to make sure you take the right call. And I just took his picture, and the person who was sitting beside Bangi, he was looking at me he was shocked, and he was wondering, why is this girl not saying anything? Because I was a Tibetan, he knew very well. So he was shocked whether why is he not shouting anything, why is he not trying to grab their cards and stuff like that. So yeah, that happened.
So this is a very interesting, like an anecdote that you shared, and I feel we Tibetans like need to go through such. I think most of us do, like you share, no, like how we are conflicted with our own identity, like whether to give, how should I say, whether to give priority to our job or occupation or who we are. So a very interesting one, Zompa. I think more Tibetans should look forward and maybe even research into such topics.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, we should do papers on these stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so this one instance, when I was in Asian College of Journalism, I've taken this elective called Critical International Issues. I was very much into IRB, but then I didn't make it into JNU, and then I and then I went to ECJ. So JNU was my first goal. I wanted to study IR. So when I was in ECJ, I chose this Critical International Issues, and there was this subject. There was this particular separate topic on China, Tibet, India issue. Okay, and this professor, she would define the diplomacy of the Tibetan India China diplomacy, and she spoke at length about the Tibet card. She sort of explained that India has not been able to use the Tibet card for so long, and that it's sort of she sort of hinted at that. I'm not saying she said that, but she was sort of hinted that the Tibet card has not been useful for the Indian government for quite some time now. I felt that all my people, all my generation of Tibetans who have been living as refugees in India, their existence was sort of defined by the diplomacy that has been, intended to be played by the Indian government. Then I had a question inside in my mind, so I was just wanted to ask that, did you mean that the Tibetan people, the way they have given us Pandit Nehru has given us asylum and all that stuff, they're not useful, they're not useless, they're useless now. So I just wanted to clarify it to her. And then when I stood up to ask that question, I literally so I was defensive in some way. Okay, I was trying to be defensive in some way, and I literally broke down because I couldn't defend my existence in India if it wasn't helping the Indian government. So I thought the whole generation of Tibetan who is living in India, who has grew up in India, and who believed that India was our nation, they would be kicked out in no second if they are no longer useful for the Indian government in case of dealing with China. So that thought popped in my mind, and I I don't know. I started crying. I started crying out in front of the whole class, and I couldn't even complete my sentence and my question for the professor. So that was a very sort of as a Tibetan student sitting in the class where you are being taught that I mean your card, your Tibet card is no longer useful for the Indian government, was a very how should I put this, was a very heartbreaking moment for me, sort of a very overwhelming experience. And wow, my existence is threatened if I'm not useful enough. That was the case. Yeah, and growing up in India, I've always felt this was my land, this was my home. We've never seen Tibet. So Shimla was my home, so I was born and brought up in Shimla. So it was literally my home, and even in TCV schools, we were always taught we should be extremely grateful for what Pandit Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel has done for us, and no one would have come to a rescue when in 1950s our grandfathers fled Tibet, but Nehru did give us the land to stay, and he even as requested by the Dalai Lama, he gave us TCB schools, which was which has been the backbone of our Tibetan economy, Tibetan culture and tradition, and that way. All my all the generations of Tibetans are extremely grateful for to Pandit Nehru, who uh, who did a lot for us, and no one would have done that. Yeah.
There are many Tibetan journalists, who are women and are
Hmm.
making great strides. Like, for example, Dojiwa, someone who pops to mind. What are your thoughts on these Tibetan women who are breaking away from, traditional taboos, stigmas, and in my eyes, representing and making us Tibetans proud and unsilenced through various platforms?
Hmm. Yeah. I think I would encourage more people to come out and pursue their goals and dreams and careers. So uh, I don't think we, as a Tibetan society, a lot needs to be done. A lot more needs to be done, because the way we are coming out, like say Doji Yangmo is doing great stuff with Indian Express, and like say I've worked with the print for 2 years, but we the pace I think at the pace at which we are sort of coming out and working at these Indian organization, I think should be a lot faster. I mean, more people should come up. And yeah, as you said, Tibetan women are exploring their career and goals or dreams, wherever it is. But I think more needs to be done. It's just a very a very few people have sort of been brave enough to pursue their goals. I think more needs to be done.
Yep, Sampa. So moving on, I would like to ask you whether you have anything to say to our Tibetan sisters and brothers and all those people who, continue to support us Tibetans, regardless of the strong wind that China continues to, rally forth.
Hmm. Yeah, for my Tibetan brothers and sisters, I think we, for me also, personally, for me, whatever we try to do in life, it was never easy for anyone. Starting as a journalist, for me personally, I can speak for myself personally, wanting to become a journalist, and then uh, getting to know the reality, be knowing the functioning of a newsroom and stuff like that, it was never easy. But then what we need to do is we need to be consistent in our effort, to work towards our dreams. That I think that is the factor that I believe is lacking in most of my Tibetan friends, and people who are in the, I mean, the coming upcoming generation. We need to focus more on our goals, and realize and be prepared to know that it won't be easy for any of us, but then still we need to be consistent in our effort, and yeah, work toward our goals and make people proud and make the government proud. Yeah, I think that's my last words.
So thank you so much, Zampala. It was a pleasure having you here. I think not only me, but all our audiences, learned a lot. And on top of this, your anecdotes were really powerful insights into what a Tibetan, especially young Tibetans goes through this generation. So thank you so much, Zampala.
Thank you so much for having me, and keep on doing such amazing stuff, Dandila. Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll listen to your episodes every day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.